The emergency session of the Tri-Galactic Council convened under circumstances that would have been unthinkable just 6 months earlier. 3 of the galaxy's most powerful civilizations teetered on the brink of a war that would consume entire star systems and leave billions dead in its wake. The holographic displays floating above the council chamber showed fleet movements, casualty projections, and resource calculations that painted a picture of impending catastrophe. High Arbitrator Velinara of the Neutral Worlds Coalition stood before the assembled delegates, her forearms gesticulating with barely controlled desperation as she addressed representatives who had spent the last century learning to hate each other with increasing sophistication. "Honored delegates," she began, her translator struggling to render the harmonic complexities of her native language into forms the various species could understand. "We have exhausted every traditional avenue for peaceful resolution. The disputed sector crisis has escalated beyond our ability to mediate through conventional diplomatic channels." The 3 primary antagonists sat in their respective sections of the chamber, radiating hostility that required no translation. High Commander Vextar of the Zephyrian Empire, his crystalline exoskeleton gleaming with the metals of a dozen conquered worlds, made no effort to hide his contempt for both his enemies and the proceedings attempting to constrain his war machine. Negotiator Krelsh of the Kassaran Dominion sat in elegant repose, her serpentine form coiled around a floating meditation platform, but her 6 eyes tracked every movement in the chamber with predatory calculation. She had built her career on turning diplomatic negotiations into elaborate traps, and everyone present knew she was already planning how to extract maximum advantage from whatever peace process emerged. War Speaker Thyron of the Vorthan Republic occupied his section like a living siege engine, his massive frame augmented with military cybernetics that made clicking sounds whenever he moved. The Vorthans had elevated warfare to an art form, and Thyron represented a culture that considered peace negotiations to be just another form of combat. The resource-rich systems of the Kepler Nexus cannot support 3 competing claims, Velinara continued, activating holographic displays that showed the disputed region. "Current projections suggest that military resolution will result in the complete destruction of the very worlds you are fighting to control." Vextar's crystalline voice cut through the chamber like breaking glass. "Arbitrator, the Zephyrian Empire has indisputable historical claims to the Nexus systems. We are prepared to defend those claims against any challenge. Historical claims mean nothing without the power to enforce them," Krelsh interjected, her voice carrying sibilant undertones that made several species reach for universal translators. "The Kassaran Dominion has invested 3 centuries in developing those systems. We will not surrender our investments to crystalline thieves or mechanical barbarians." Thyron's response was a subsonic rumble that registered as threat assessment. "Warnings on most delegates' personal defense systems. The Vorthan Republic recognizes only the law of strength. Both your civilizations will learn the price of challenging warriors who have never known defeat." Velinara felt the familiar weight of impending galactic catastrophe settling on her shoulders. As head of the Neutral Worlds Coalition, she had successfully mediated conflicts for over 2 centuries, but this crisis was different. The 3 empires were too evenly matched for anyone to achieve decisive victory, which meant the war would continue until all 3 civilizations had exhausted themselves. "Honored delegates," she said, her voice carrying a note of desperation that shocked those who knew her reputation for unflappable diplomacy, "we need a neutral venue for expanded negotiations. Somewhere that none of your civilizations can claim, intimidate, or corrupt." "And where exactly do you propose we conduct these expanded negotiations?" Vextar asked, his tone suggesting he already considered the effort futile. "Every traditional neutral world has declined to host the summit," Velinara admitted. The risk of becoming a target for retaliation is too great. We need somewhere that poses no threat to any party, somewhere that can guarantee genuine neutrality." "Impossible," Kralsh stated flatly. "Any world capable of guaranteeing neutrality between our three empires would necessarily possess sufficient power to threaten us. And any world that poses no threat lacks the capability to maintain neutrality." It was Ambassador Quex of the Minor Worlds Collective who made the suggestion that would change galactic history. Quex was a little-regarded representative from a federation of primitive worlds that existed on the fringes of civilized space. His species had only achieved interstellar flight within the last few centuries, and most council members considered him a curiosity rather than a serious participant in galactic affairs. "Honored arbitrator," Quex said, his voice barely carrying across the chamber, "what about that primitive world in the Sol system, the one with the carbon-based bipeds?" The silence that followed was so complete that the chamber's life support system seemed unnaturally loud. "Are you seriously suggesting," Vextar said slowly, "that we conduct negotiations between galactic powers on a backwater death world populated by primitives who have barely achieved basic spaceflight?" "It would certainly be neutral," Quex replied, apparently missing the incredulous tones of the various translators. "The humans have no galactic ambitions, no advanced technology, and no military capability worth considering. They're too primitive to threaten anyone and too insignificant to favor any particular side." Kralsh's laugh was like the sound of breaking crystal. "Negotiations on a Class 12 death world with beings who still use chemical explosives and kinetic weapons? The very suggestion is absurd." "Is it?" Velinara asked, and something in her tone made the entire chamber fall silent. "Think about it. A world that poses no threat to any of our civilizations. A species too primitive to have hidden agendas or secret alliances. An environment so hostile that none of us would want to claim it even if we could." Thyron's cybernetic implants clicked as he processed the implications. "You're suggesting we use primitives as neutral arbitrators?" "I'm suggesting we use their world as a neutral venue," Velinara corrected. "The humans wouldn't arbitrate anything. They lack the sophistication for meaningful diplomatic input. But their world could serve as a location where none of us have any advantages or hidden preparations." The debate that followed was unlike anything in the Council's history. The idea of conducting high-level galactic diplomacy on a primitive world was so unprecedented that there were no protocols, no precedents, and no established procedures for even considering such an arrangement. The logistical challenges alone would be immense, pointed out technical advisor Zexkel. "Environmental suits, atmospheric processors, gravity adjusters, we'd essentially have to create a livable environment from scratch, which would be prohibitively expensive for any one civilization to dominate," Velinara noted. "Perfect neutrality through mutual inconvenience. And what about the primitives themselves?" Kralsh asked. "These humans, would they even be capable of understanding what we're asking of them?" Ambassador Quex consulted his database. "According to our latest intelligence reports, humans are eager for galactic contact. They have primitive but functional diplomatic institutions. They would likely be honored to host such significant negotiations." "Honored," Vextar repeated, as if the concept of primitives being honored by the attention of their betters was too obvious to warrant discussion. "Yes, they would probably be pathetically grateful for the opportunity to serve civilized species." Supreme Negotiator Kralsh uncoiled from her meditation platform, her serpentine form flowing into a more active configuration. "There is a certain appeal to conducting negotiations where we would all be equally disadvantaged ... by the primitive conditions." War Speaker Theron's cybernetic systems hummed as he ran tactical analyses. "An environment where none of us can deploy our usual advantages," where success would depend purely on negotiating skill rather than technological or military superiority. Velinara sensed the mood shifting and pressed her advantage. Honored delegates, we are facing a war that will devastate entire sectors of the galaxy. If the choice is between experimental diplomacy on a primitive world or certain catastrophe, surely the risk is worth taking. The vote, when it finally came, was closer than anyone had expected. By a margin of 3 votes, the Tri-Galactic Council authorized the unprecedented step of requesting permission from a primitive world to host negotiations between galactic powers. 3 days later, Secretary General Maria Santos of the United Nations received a message that would transform humanity's understanding of its place in the universe. Santos stood in the emergency session chamber of the UN Security Council, staring at the holographic display that showed the translated text of the first official communication Earth had ever received from an extraterrestrial civilization. "Ladies and gentlemen," she said, her voice carrying a mixture of excitement and disbelief that matched the expressions on every face in the room. "We have just been asked to host peace negotiations between 3 galactic empires." The silence that followed was broken by the British representative, Sir Charles Whitmore, whose diplomatic training had prepared him for many things but not for this. "I'm sorry, Secretary General, did you say galactic empires? As in multiple star-spanning civilizations?" "According to the message," Santos replied, consulting the translation that had taken their best linguists and computer systems 18 hours to decode. "We are being offered the honor of providing a neutral venue for negotiations that will determine the fate of billions of sentient beings across thousands of star systems." Russian President Petrov leaned forward, his expression skeptical. "And why exactly are these galactic powers asking us for help? We barely have a functioning space program." Santos activated another section of the translated message. "According to their communication, Earth is considered ideal as a neutral venue precisely because we are too primitive to threaten any party, and too insignificant to favor any particular side." The Chinese representative, Premier Chun, raised an eyebrow. "They're calling us too primitive and insignificant to matter? They're also offering to share advanced technologies in exchange for our hosting services," Santos pointed out. "Faster-than-light communication, advanced materials science, medical technologies that could revolutionize human healthcare. What exactly would hosting these negotiations involve?" asked German Chancellor Müller. Santos consulted her briefing. "Materials. They're requesting permission to build a neutral facility somewhere on Earth where their delegates can meet safely. They'll provide all the advanced technology needed to create suitable environments for their various species. All we need to do is provide the location and guarantee that we won't interfere in their proceedings." President Jackson of the United States looked around the room at his fellow world leaders. "Are we seriously considering this? Opening our planet to alien civilizations we know nothing about? We're considering," Santos replied firmly, "the greatest opportunity in human history. First contact with not just one but multiple advanced civilizations. The chance to learn that we're not alone in the universe, and the possibility of gaining access to technologies that could solve most of humanity's current problems." The debate that followed consumed the next 6 hours and would have continued longer if not for the aliens' message indicating that their offer was time-sensitive. The galactic war they were trying to prevent was approaching a point of no return. In the end, the vote was unanimous. Earth would host the galaxy's most important peace negotiations. The construction of Harmony Station took place with a speed that defied human understanding of large-scale engineering projects. The aliens had selected a site in international waters of the Pacific Ocean, where massive automated systems worked around the clock to build a facility that could accommodate the Environmental needs of three completely different species. President. Jackson stood on the deck of the USS Enterprise, watching alien construction drones work with efficiency that made human engineering look like children playing with building blocks. The structure rising from the ocean was unlike anything in human experience, a flowing combination of crystalline spires, organic curves, and geometric precision that seemed to shift and change depending on the viewing angle. Dr. Kim, he said to the xenobiologist who had been assigned as humanities scientific liaison, "What exactly are we looking at?" Dr. Sarah Kim consulted her instruments, which were registering readings that pushed the boundaries of her understanding. "Mr. President, we're looking at construction technology that appears to manipulate matter at the molecular level. They're not just building a structure, they're growing it. And this is what they consider basic construction? According to their technical specifications, this is a simple temporary facility suitable for primitive environmental conditions," Dr. Kim replied. "I don't think they understand that what they're building here represents technology centuries beyond our current capabilities." General Patricia Hayes, who had been placed in charge of Earth security arrangements for the summit, lowered her binoculars with an expression of professional concern. "Dr. Kim, what are our defense options if these aliens decide they like our planet too much to leave?" Dr. Kim's laugh was tinged with nervous energy. "General, based on what we've observed of their construction capabilities alone, our defense options would be prayer and hope they have a sense of humor." 3 weeks later, the delegates began arriving. The first ship to enter Earth's solar system was like nothing human astronomers had ever observed. The Zephyrian Empire's diplomatic vessel appeared to be carved from a single massive crystal, its faceted surfaces refracting sunlight into patterns that hurt to look at directly. It moved through space without any visible propulsion system, changing direction and velocity with the fluid grace of something swimming through water rather than traveling through vacuum. Hi. Commander Vextar materialized on the bridge of the human observation station through what could only be described as controlled teleportation. One moment the space was empty, the next it contained a being that looked like living crystal given humanoid form. "I am High Commander Vextar of the Zephyrian Empire," he announced, his voice resonating through frequencies that made human teeth ache. "We acknowledge your primitive world service as neutral ground for these proceedings." Secretary General Santos, who had spent weeks preparing for this moment, stepped forward with a kind of diplomatic smile that had served her well in countless international negotiations. "High Commander, welcome to Earth. We are honored to host representatives of your great civilization and look forward to facilitating successful negotiations." Vextar's crystalline form shifted, creating new facets that caught the light in patterns that conveyed emotions humans had no words for. "Honored? Yes. Primitives would naturally consider service to advanced civilizations to be an honor. We trust you will perform your simple duties adequately." Before Santos could formulate a response to what was clearly intended as a dismissive comment, alarms began sounding throughout the station. The second delegation had arrived. The Kassaran Dominion ship emerged from hyperspace, like a living thing uncoiling from some cosmic egg. Its biomechanical design suggested a fusion of advanced technology and evolved biology that challenged human understanding of both engineering and life itself. Weapon systems that looked disturbingly organic tracked human vessels with predatory calculation. Supreme Negotiator Kraelsch didn't bother with transportation beams or materialization. Her ship simply extruded a tendril that connected to the station's docking port, and she flowed through the resulting passage like liquid intelligence given serpentine form. "Humans," she said, her 6 eyes independently focusing on different members of the human delegation, "you will address me as Supreme Negotiator." Your role in these proceedings is to remain silent unless directly questioned, and to ensure that our basic needs are met with acceptable efficiency. Santos felt her diplomatic training warring with a distinctly human urge to tell the snake woman exactly what she thought of that attitude. Supreme Negotiator, we welcome you to Earth and look forward to working with you to achieve a peaceful resolution. Working with us? Krelsh's laugh was like the sound of wind through dead leaves. Primitive, you misunderstand your function here. You are not working with us. You are serving us. We trust the distinction is clear. The arrival of the third delegation made the previous two seem subtle by comparison. The Vorthan Republic's warship dropped out of hyperspace with weapon systems active and targeting solutions locked onto both of the vessels already in orbit. It was a massive, angular construction that looked like it had been designed by someone who considered subtlety to be a character flaw. Every surface bristled with weapon emplacements, sensor arrays, and defensive systems. War Speaker Theron didn't transport to the station so much as he invaded it. His armored form came through the docking port like a one-man army, cybernetic. Implants whirring and clicking as they cataloged every potential threat in his vicinity. "I am War Speaker Theron," he announced, his voice amplified by vocal enhancements that made the station's bulkheads vibrate. "You will explain your planetary defense capabilities and provide detailed specifications of your military installations." General Hayes, who had been dealing with alien attitudes for the past hour, stepped forward with the kind of professional calm that came from 30 years of military service. "War Speaker, Earth's defensive capabilities are minimal. We're not a military threat to anyone present." Thyron's cybernetic systems hummed as they processed this information. "Minimal defenses? Then how do you maintain planetary security?" "We don't really have planetary security in the sense you probably mean," Hayes replied honestly. "Most of our military forces are designed for conflicts between human nations, not for defending against alien invasions." "Fascinating," Theron sighed, and his tone suggested he was already calculating how quickly the Vorthan Republic could conquer Earth if it became strategically necessary. "We will require detailed intelligence about your primitive weapon systems." "I'll be happy to provide whatever information you need," Hayes replied, mentally noting that the alien delegates seemed to be treating humanity as some combination of servants and potential threats to be cataloged. The formal opening of the negotiations took place 3 days later, after the various alien delegations had established their environmental requirements and security protocols. Harmony Station had been transformed into a complex maze of interconnected chambers, each designed to accommodate the specific atmospheric, gravitational, and temperature needs of the visiting species. Secretary General Santa stood in the central chamber, which had been designed as a neutral space where all three species could interact safely. The technology required to create an environment suitable for crystalline beings, serpentine bioforms, and cybernetically enhanced warriors was beyond human comprehension, but it worked seamlessly. "Honored delegates," Santos began, using the diplomatic protocols that had been hastily developed for the occasion. "We welcome you to Earth and to these historic negotiations. Humanity stands ready to assist in any way possible to help you achieve a peaceful resolution to your differences." The response from the alien delegates was immediate and unexpectedly unified. They all turned to stare at Santos with expressions that human translators rendered as various forms of incredulous amusement. "Assist?" Vextar's crystalline voice carried harmonics that definitely qualified as condescending. "Primitive, your species lacks the cognitive sophistication to understand the issues we are negotiating, much less assist in their resolution." "Your function," Krelsh added, her 6 eyes tracking Santos with predatory focus. is to ensure that our environmental needs are met and to remain available in case we require simple services. You are innkeepers, Theron stated bluntly. Nothing more. Santos felt something shift inside her chest, not quite anger, not quite determination, but something that any human diplomat would have recognized as the moment when politeness stops being sufficient. I understand, she said carefully, that you view our technological capabilities as primitive. But Earth has a long history of successful conflict resolution, and we've found that sometimes an outside perspective can be valuable in breaking deadlocks. The silence that followed was filled with the kind of alien communication that human sensors could detect but not interpret. Finally, Krailsh responded with what sounded suspiciously like amusement. Very well, primitive. Since you seem eager to contribute, you may observe our proceedings. Perhaps you will learn something about how civilized species conduct diplomacy. However, Vextar added, you will not speak unless directly addressed, and you will remember that your opinions on galactic affairs are neither requested nor relevant. Santos nodded with the kind of diplomatic grace that had served her through decades of international negotiations, while privately wondering exactly how humanity had become the galactic equivalent of hotel staff. The first formal, negotiating session began with each delegation presenting their claims to the disputed Kepler Nexus systems. The presentations involved holographic displays, historical documentation, and technical analyses that demonstrated just how far beyond human understanding galactic civilization had progressed. But as Santos listened to the arguments, she began to recognize patterns that were depressingly familiar from her years of mediating international disputes. The same basic positions, the same intractable claims, the same inability to find common ground that had plagued human diplomacy for centuries. The Zephyrian Empire's historical claims are based on initial survey data collected over 3,000 years ago, Vextar was explaining, his crystalline form generating holographic displays that showed stellar cartography spanning millennia. Our people were the first to catalog these systems and establish their resource potential. Historical claims without practical development are meaningless, Krailsh countered, her biomechanical implants interfacing directly with the stations. Computer systems to project competing data. The Kassaran Dominion has invested actual resources and infrastructure in these systems for over 7 centuries. Mere surveys do not constitute valid territorial claims. Both your civilizations ignore the fundamental principle of territorial acquisition, Theron interrupted, his cybernetic enhancements generating tactical displays that showed military force deployments throughout the disputed region. The Vorthan Republic recognizes only the law of strength. We have the military capability to take and hold these systems. That makes them ours by right of conquest. Santos watched the presentations with growing fascination. These were supposedly advanced galactic civilizations, but their approach to conflict resolution seemed remarkably similar to human tribes arguing over hunting grounds. If I may, she said during a pause in the presentations, I notice that each of your civilizations is approaching this dispute from a different philosophical framework. Commander Vextar is emphasizing historical precedent. Negotiator Krailsh is focusing on economic investment, and War Speaker Theron is advocating for military supremacy. Has anyone considered whether these systems might be large enough to accommodate shared development? The reaction was immediate and unanimous. All 3 alien delegates turned to stare at Santos, with expressions that human translators struggled to render into comprehensible terms. Shared development? Vextar's voice carried frequencies that suggested the concept was not just foreign but actively repulsive. The primitive suggests we cooperate with rival civilizations? The very suggestion demonstrates why your species is unsuited for galactic affairs, Kralsh added, her serpentine form coiling with what appeared to be agitation. Civilized beings do not share territorial claims with competitors. Cooperation is weakness, Farron stated flatly. Victory belongs to the strong, not to those who compromise. Santos felt another shift in her perspective, this one less diplomatic and more educational. I see. So your three civilizations prefer to fight a war that will likely destroy the very systems you're fighting over, rather than explore the possibility of finding mutual benefit through cooperation. The systems are either ours or they belong to our enemies, Vextar replied as if explaining something obvious to a child. There is no middle ground in territorial disputes. Why not? Santos asked, and the simplicity of the question seemed to catch all three delegates off guard. Because? Kralsh began, then paused, her 6 eyes blinking in sequence as she processed the implications of the question. Because that is not how civilized species conduct territorial negotiations, Thyron finished, though his tone suggested he was not entirely certain of his answer. But you're not making progress with your current approach, Santos pointed out. You've been negotiating for months without achieving any meaningful compromise. Meanwhile, the military buildup in the disputed region is costing all three of your civilizations enormous resources. Have you calculated the economic impact of continued conflict versus the potential benefits of shared development? The silence that followed was different from the previous dismissive pauses. This time, the alien delegates seemed to be actually considering what she had said. The primitive raises an interesting point about resource allocation, Vextar admitted reluctantly. Our military expenditures for this conflict have exceeded the projected value of exclusive control over the disputed systems. Kassaran economic. Analysts have reached similar conclusions, Kralsh added, her tone suggesting she was surprised to find herself agreeing with a primitive. The cost of conquering and defending these systems against two rival civilizations would consume the profits from their development for several centuries. Military victory is valuable beyond mere economic calculation, Thyron insisted, but his cybernetic systems were clearly running cost-benefit analyses even as he spoke. However, the resource expenditure required to achieve decisive victory over both rival civilizations simultaneously would be substantial. Santos felt a familiar satisfaction that came from finding the crack in an apparently intractable negotiating position. So what I'm hearing is that all three of your civilizations would benefit economically from finding a peaceful solution, but your cultural frameworks make it difficult to explore cooperative options? Cultural frameworks? Kralsh's serpentine form uncoiled slightly. Explain this primitive concept. Well, Santos said, settling into the kind of patient explanation that had served her through countless diplomatic briefings, it seems like each of your civilizations has developed specific cultural assumptions about how territorial disputes should be resolved. But those assumptions might not be optimal for this particular situation. She activated the chamber's holographic display system, which the aliens had been using to present their competing claims. May I? The three delegates exchanged glances that conveyed volumes of silent communication before Vextar gave a crystalline shrug. Proceed, primitive. We are curious to observe how your undeveloped minds approach complex problems. Santos began by displaying the disputed systems using the data the aliens had already provided. So we have the Kepler Nexus, 17th star. Systems with various valuable resources and strategic locations. Currently uninhabited except for some automated mining and research installations. She highlighted different systems with different colors. Now, Commander Vextar, your historical claims are strongest in these 7 systems, where Zephyrian surveys were conducted first and most thoroughly. Vextar's crystalline form brightened slightly. Correct. Those systems rightfully belong to the Zephyrian Empire. A negotiator Krailshire economic investments are concentrated in these 6 systems, where Kasserine infrastructure and development projects are most advanced. The Dominion's legitimate claims to the fruits of our labor, Krailsh agreed. War Speaker. Thyron, your military analyses indicate that these 4 systems would provide the greatest strategic advantage for controlling the entire region. The most tactically significant positions. Thyron confirmed. Santos smiled with the kind of satisfaction that came from seeing a solution that should have been obvious to everyone involved. So we have 17 systems and your 3 civilizations. Have identified 18 systems as essential to your core interests. The alien delegates stared at the display, their various cognitive processes clearly working through the mathematical implications. The primitive appears to be suggesting, Vextar said slowly, that our essential interests overlap less than we assumed. There are only 4 systems where your claims directly conflict, Santos confirmed, which means that there are 13 systems where peaceful allocation might be possible without anyone giving up their core interests. But what about the 4 disputed systems? Krailsh asked, her predatory focus now directed at the problem rather than at Santos. Joint development, Santos replied. Shared costs, shared benefits, shared security responsibilities. You'd need to negotiate the specific terms, but the basic principle is that cooperation might be more profitable than conquest. Thyron's cybernetic implants hummed as they processed tactical and economic projections simultaneously. Joint development would require unprecedented cooperation between rival civilizations. Yes, Santos agreed. It would. Is that a problem? The question hung in the air while 3 of the galaxy's most advanced civilizations grappled with the concept that humans had been experimenting with for millennia, the idea that competitors could sometimes achieve better results by working together than by fighting each other. We would need extensive security protocols, Vextar said finally. Safeguards against espionage, technology theft, territorial encroachment. Detailed economic frameworks, Krailsh added. Profit-sharing agreements, resource allocation schedules, dispute resolution mechanisms. Military oversight, Theron concluded. Joint security forces, standardized defensive protocols, coordinated response procedures. Santos felt the familiar thrill of a successful negotiation beginning to take shape. Those are all solvable problems. The question is whether you're willing to try a cooperative approach instead of a competitive one. What followed was the most intensive week of negotiations in Santos's career. The 3 alien delegations, once they grasped the concept of cooperative development, threw themselves into the technical details with the kind of analytical precision that only highly advanced civilizations could muster. But as the negotiations progressed, Santos began to notice something strange about the alien delegates' behavior. They were making progress on the territorial dispute, but they were also spending increasing amounts of time asking questions about Earth, human culture, and humanity's approach to conflict resolution. Primitive Santos, Vextar said during a break between formal sessions, your species' historical records indicate that humans have engaged in cooperative territorial development before. How do you resolve disputes when cooperation fails? It was an innocent enough question, but something about the way all 3 delegates focused on her answer made Santos feel like she was being evaluated rather than simply questioned. Well, she replied carefully, we've developed various mechanisms over the centuries. International courts, arbitration panels, economic sanctions, diplomatic pressure. When those fail, sometimes military intervention becomes necessary. Military intervention, Thyron repeated, his cybernetic systems clearly filing the information away. Your species uses force to maintain cooperative agreements? As a last resort, Santos clarified. But yes, we've learned that cooperative Frameworks require enforcement mechanisms. Otherwise, they tend to break down when one party decides that violating the agreement would be more profitable than honoring it. The alien delegates exchanged more of their silent communications, and Santos had the distinct impression that she had just said something significant without realizing it. "And how?" Kralsh asked, her serpentine form coiling with what might have been nervous energy. "Does your species enforce cooperative agreements on a planetary scale?" Santos felt like she was walking through a minefield, but she couldn't identify exactly where the danger lay. Through various international institutions. The United Nations, the International Court of Justice, regional security organizations. We've built a system of international law that most human nations recognize and generally follow. Generally follow? Vextar's crystalline voice carried harmonic undertones that suggested intense interest. "Well, compliance isn't perfect," Santos admitted. "But the combination of diplomatic pressure, economic consequences, and the threat of international intervention has been fairly effective at maintaining global stability." "International intervention," Thyron said, and his tone made it sound like he was learning a new language. "Your primitive species has mechanisms for forcing compliance with cooperative agreements." "I wouldn't call it primitive," Santos replied, feeling a slight edge of defensiveness creep into her voice. "Our international system has evolved over centuries of trial and error. It's not perfect, but it works reasonably well." The alien delegates fell silent for several minutes, their various forms of nonverbal communication creating a complex symphony of lights, harmonics, and electromagnetic fields that human sensors could detect but not interpret. "Primitive Santos," Kralsh said finally, "we would like to observe examples of your species' conflict resolution mechanisms in action. Would it be possible to tour your planetary governmental institutions?" Santos felt her diplomatic instincts warning her that this request was about something more than academic curiosity, but she couldn't see any reasonable basis for refusing. "Of course. I'd be happy to arrange visits to the United Nations, the International Court, and various regional organizations. We would be particularly interested," Vextar added, "in observing your enforcement mechanisms. How do you compel compliance from entities that prefer to violate cooperative agreements?" "And what are the consequences," Theron continued, "for civilized beings who choose to disrupt your planetary stability?" Santos felt reality shifting around her as she began to understand that the alien delegates were asking questions that went far beyond academic interest in human institutions. "Are you," she asked carefully, "asking about Earth's defensive capabilities?" "We are asking," Kralsh replied with a kind of precision that suggested every word had been carefully chosen, "about your species' methods for maintaining the cooperative agreements that you have recommended for resolving our territorial dispute." Santos realized that what had started as a simple question about human conflict resolution had somehow become an inquiry into Earth's ability to enforce galactic peace agreements. "I think," she said slowly, "that we should probably involve some additional human representatives in these discussions." Within hours, General Hayes found herself giving the most surreal military briefing of her career to an audience of alien diplomats who seemed intensely interested in humanity's capacity for violence. "As I explained to War Speaker Thyron earlier," Hayes began, activating holographic displays that showed Earth's basic military organization, "our defensive capabilities are primarily designed for conflicts between human nations. We don't really have weapon systems designed to threaten galactic civilizations." "But you do have weapon systems," Vextar observed, his crystalline form refracting the light from the displays and patterns that suggested analytical processing. "Well, yes," Hayes admitted. "Every nation maintains military forces for self-defense and power projection." "Power projection," Thyron repeated, his cybernetic implants clearly cataloging every detail of Hayes's presentation. Explain this primitive concept. Hayes felt like she was being led down a path she didn't fully understand, but her military training emphasized the importance of accurate intelligence sharing with allied forces. Power projection refers to a nation's ability to deploy military force beyond its borders to influence events in other regions. Your species deploys military force beyond territorial boundaries to influence the behavior of other entities, Kralsh stated, her 6 eyes tracking Hayes with predatory focus. In certain circumstances, yes, Hayes replied. When our national interests are threatened, when we have treaty obligations to allies, or when international stability is at risk. International stability, Vextar said, and something about his tone made Hayes wonder if she was being interrogated rather than simply briefed. General Hayes, Thyron said, his massive form leaning forward with obvious interest. What would your species do if, hypothetically, entities who had agreed to cooperative frameworks decided to violate those agreements and return to competitive conflict? Hayes felt her military instincts engaging as she recognized a scenario-based intelligence probe. That would depend on the specific circumstances, War Speaker. But if the violation threatened international stability or harmed our allies, we would probably respond with a combination of diplomatic pressure, economic sanctions, and, if necessary, military intervention. Military intervention to enforce cooperative agreements, Kralsh said, her serpentine form coiling with what Hayes was learning to recognize as intense interest. If other methods failed, yes, Hayes confirmed. Our species has learned that cooperative frameworks only work if there are consequences for violating them. The alien delegates exchanged more of their complex nonverbal communications, and Hayes had the growing sense that she was providing information that was being the alien delegates exchanged more of their complex nonverbal communications, and Hayes had the growing sense that she was providing information that was being used for purposes she didn't fully understand. General Hayes, Vextar said, his crystalline voice carrying new harmonics that Hayes's translator rendered as barely controlled nervousness. Would it be possible to observe a demonstration of your species' military capabilities? Hayes felt her eyebrows rising. A demonstration? What kind of demonstration? We are curious, Thyron said, his cybernetic systems humming with what sounded like analytical excitement, about the practical application of human enforcement mechanisms. How do you actually compel compliance from entities that choose to violate cooperative agreements? Hayes looked around the room at 3 alien beings who were supposedly more advanced than humanity, but seemed intensely interested in humanity's capacity for violence. Something about their focused attention was setting off every alarm bell her military experience had installed. Well, she said carefully, we could arrange for you to observe some training exercises. Nothing too elaborate. Basic military maneuvers, weapons demonstrations, coordination protocols. The reaction from the alien delegates was immediate and intense. Their various forms of nonverbal communication created a symphony of lights, harmonics, and electromagnetic patterns that made the station sensors register multiple warning signals. Training exercises, Kralsh repeated, her 6 eyes blinking. In rapid sequence. Your species practices enforcement procedures regularly? Of course, Hayes replied, wondering why this seemed significant. Military readiness requires constant training. We run exercises almost continuously across various theaters and scenarios. Various scenarios, Vextar said, and his crystalline form was generating light patterns that Hayes's instruments couldn't quite interpret, including scenarios for enforcing compliance with international agreements? Among others, yes, Hayes. Confirmed. peacekeeping operations, humanitarian interventions, alliance defense scenarios, deterrence postures. We trained for a wide range of contingencies. Thyron's cybernetic implants were clicking and whirring with what sounded like frantic processing. Your species maintains continuous readiness to deploy enforcement mechanisms across multiple operational frameworks. Hayes was beginning to realize that her matter-of-fact descriptions of standard military procedures were having an unexpected effect on the alien delegates. They seemed simultaneously fascinated and increasingly nervous about humanity's approach to conflict resolution. "General," Santos said, appearing in the briefing chamber with the kind of diplomatic urgency that Hayes recognized as a barely controlled crisis, "I think we need to expand our cultural exchange program. Our guests have expressed interest in observing more aspects of human civilization." "What aspects specifically?" Hayes asked, though she suspected she already knew the answer. "They want to tour our enforcement infrastructure," Santos replied, her tone suggesting that she was still trying to understand exactly what the aliens were asking for. Military bases, command centers, weapons manufacturing facilities, strategic planning institutions. Hayes felt a chill of understanding. The alien delegates weren't just interested in human military capabilities. They were conducting a comprehensive intelligence assessment of Earth's ability to function as a galactic enforcement mechanism. "Secretary General," she said carefully, "I think we need to discuss exactly what our guests are expecting from this cultural exchange." The conversation that followed was unlike anything in the history of diplomacy. 3 galactic civilizations, supposedly more advanced than humanity in every meaningful way, systematically interrogated human representatives about Earth's capacity to serve as an enforcement mechanism for galactic cooperative agreements. "The fundamental question," Vextar explained, his crystalline form generating holographic displays that showed the territorial agreement they had been negotiating, "is how to ensure that parties to cooperative frameworks maintain their commitments. Over time, advanced civilizations," Krell shouted, her serpentine form coiled in what Hayes was learning to recognize as analytical mode, "have learned to calculate the precise point at which violating agreements becomes more profitable than honoring them. Without enforcement mechanisms, all cooperative frameworks eventually collapse. Your species," Thyron concluded, his cybernetic systems generating tactical analyses that filled the air around them, "appears to have developed practical experience with enforcement mechanisms. We require detailed intelligence about your capabilities." Santos felt reality reshaping itself around her as the true nature of the aliens' interest in Earth became clear. "You're not just asking for our help with negotiations. You're asking if we can serve as ... galactic police?" "Police," Vextar repeated, his translator clearly struggling with the concept. "Entities responsible for enforcing compliance with agreed-upon behavioral standards." "Yes," Krell said, her 6 eyes focusing on Santos with predatory intensity. "That is exactly what we are asking." Hayes felt her military training warring with her sense of the absurd. "You're asking a single-planet species with primitive technology to enforce agreements between galactic empires?" "Primitive technology," Thyron said, and his tone suggested that he was beginning to question that assessment. "General Hayes, would it be possible to observe a demonstration of your primitive enforcement capabilities?" What followed was the most surreal military demonstration in human history. General Hayes found herself conducting a comprehensive briefing on Earth's military capabilities for an audience of alien observers who seemed to be evaluating humanity's suitability for galactic peacekeeping duties. The demonstration began at Peterson Space Force Base, where Hayes arranged for the alien delegates to observe what she described as basic orbital defense procedures. "These are our standard satellite monitoring systems," she explained, gesturing to displays that showed real-time tracking of every object in Earth's orbital space. We maintain continuous surveillance of anything that might pose a threat to planetary security. The alien delegates studied the displays with growing intensity. To Hayes, the satellite network represented a basic early warning system that any spacefaring civilization would develop. To the aliens, it apparently represented something more significant. Continuous surveillance, Vextar noted, his crystalline form analyzing the data streams with obvious interest. Your species monitors all traffic in your local space? Of course, Hayes replied. It's basic situational awareness. We need to know what's happening in our neighborhood. And what do you do? Krailch asked. When you detect unauthorized or threatening activity, Hayes activated another display, showing the integrated response protocols that connected civilian monitoring systems with military assets. We have escalating response procedures: diplomatic contact, warning signals, defensive positioning, and if necessary, active engagement. Active engagement, Theron repeated, his cybernetic systems clearly processing the implications. You deploy military force against entities that threaten your planetary security. When other methods fail, yes, Hayes confirmed. Our primary goal is deterrence, but we maintain the capability to defend ourselves if deterrence fails. The aliens exchanged more of their complex nonverbal communications, and Hayes was beginning to recognize the patterns that indicated intense analytical discussion. General Hayes, Vextar said finally, would it be possible to observe your deterrence mechanisms in action? Hayes felt like she was falling down a rabbit hole that led to places she couldn't have imagined. What exactly did you have in mind? A practical demonstration, Krailch explained. Perhaps a scenario where unauthorized vessels approach your planetary space and your species deploys appropriate deterrence measures. Hayes stared at the alien delegates, trying to process the implications of what they were requesting. You want us to simulate a planetary defense scenario for your observation? We want to understand, Theron said, his massive form leaning forward with obvious interest, how your species actually implements enforcement procedures under realistic conditions. Against every instinct screaming that this was a terrible idea, Hayes found herself coordinating with military commands around the globe to stage the most elaborate war game in human history. The scenario was straightforward. Unauthorized alien vessels had entered Earth's solar system and were approaching planetary space despite repeated warnings to maintain safe distances. Human military forces would demonstrate their response protocols while alien observers monitored the proceedings. What the aliens observed over the next 6 hours fundamentally changed their understanding of humanity's place in the galactic order. The demonstration began with what Hayes described as standard diplomatic contact procedures. Radio communications in multiple languages, mathematical sequences, and peaceful overture protocols that any spacefaring civilization would recognize. These are your initial response measures, Vextar observed, his crystalline form tracking. The communication attempts. You attempt peaceful resolution before deploying force. Always, Hayes confirmed. Military action is always the last resort. But when the simulated intruders continued approaching despite repeated warnings, the human response escalated with a speed and coordination that left the alien observers stunned. Orbital defense platforms that the aliens had dismissed as primitive communication satellites suddenly revealed themselves to be disguised weapon systems. Military spacecraft that had been hidden throughout the solar system emerged from concealment with targeting solutions already locked onto the intruding vessels. Ground-based installations that appeared to be research facilities activated defensive systems that registered as significant threats even on advanced alien sensors. Your primitive defense network, Krelsh said, her 6 eyes tracking multiple simultaneous tactical displays, was concealed within civilian infrastructure. Basic defensive doctrine, Hayes replied matter-of-factly. You don't advertise your capabilities to potential enemies. Better to be underestimated. Thyron's cybernetic systems were generating tactical analyses at a pace that was making his implants overheat. Your species has integrated military and civilian infrastructure to create a comprehensive defensive matrix. Of course, Hayes said, wondering why this seemed significant. Modern warfare requires total resource integration. You can't separate military and civilian capabilities in any meaningful way. The aliens watched in fascination as human military forces demonstrated coordination across multiple theaters simultaneously. Space-based assets, aerial platforms, naval forces, and ground installations worked together with a kind of seamless integration that suggested extensive practice and sophisticated command structures. This level of coordination, Vextar observed, requires advanced command and control systems. And extensive training, Krelsh added, her analytical systems clearly struggling to process the complexity of human military organization. How often does your species practice these procedures? Thyron asked. Hayes consulted her briefing materials. We run major exercises like this several times per year. Smaller-scale training happens almost continuously. Every branch of service, every theater command, every allied nation participates in regular readiness assessments. Regular readiness assessments, Vextar repeated, his crystalline form generating light patterns that Hayes's translator rendered as barely controlled alarm. Your species maintains continuous preparation for large-scale enforcement operations, Krelsh stated. It's called military readiness, Hayes replied. Any responsible government maintains the capability to defend its territory and interests. But the most shocking part of the demonstration came when Hayes explained the scope of human military integration. Of course, what you're seeing here is just our planetary defense network, she said as the exercise concluded. Our actual military capabilities extend throughout the solar system and include rapid deployment options for interplanetary operations. The alien delegates fell silent, their various forms of communication creating a complex pattern of lights and harmonics that suggested intense discussion. Interplanetary operations, Thyron said finally. Well, yes, Hayes replied. We have military installations on Luna, Mars, and several asteroid bases, plus our deep space monitoring stations and rapid response fleets. Rapid response fleets, Krelsh repeated. For contingencies that might arise anywhere in the system, Hayes confirmed. We learned early that effective defense requires the ability to project force wherever it might be needed. Vextar's crystalline form had gone completely still, generating no light patterns at all. Your species has distributed military assets throughout your entire star system for rapid deployment to any location where enforcement might be required. The basic strategic doctrine, Hayes said, beginning to wonder why her descriptions of standard military practice were having such a profound effect on the alien delegates. The tour continued over the next several days, with the aliens requesting detailed briefings on every aspect of human military organization. They observed training exercises, manufacturing facilities, command centers, and strategic planning sessions with the kind of intense focus that Hayes associated with intelligence gathering operations, but it wasn't until they visited the United Nations headquarters that the true scope of their interest became clear. Secretary General Santos stood in the General Assembly Hall, explaining the basic structure of international cooperation to alien beings who supposedly represented civilizations millions of years more advanced than humanity. A fundamental principle, she said, activating displays that showed the UN's organizational structure is that cooperation requires enforcement mechanisms. Nations agree to certain standards of behavior, and the international community maintains the capability to ensure compliance. Ensure compliance, Vextar repeated, his crystalline voice carrying harmonics that Santos' translator rendered as fascination mixed with growing dread. Through a combination of diplomatic pressure, economic consequences, and when necessary, military intervention, Santos confirmed. The goal is always peaceful resolution, but the option of enforcement provides the foundation that makes peaceful resolution possible. And this system, Krailsh asked, her serpentine form coiled in analytical mode, has been effective at maintaining planetary stability? Reasonably effective, Santos replied. We haven't had a global war in decades, and most international disputes are resolved through diplomatic channels. Because, Theron said, his cybernetic systems processing the implications, entities that might prefer conflict understand that the international community will intervene to prevent it. Exactly, Santos confirmed. Deterrence works when potential aggressors understand that the costs of aggression will exceed any possible benefits. The alien delegates exchanged more of their complex communications, and Santos could sense that. She had just confirmed something they had been trying to understand. Secretary General Santos, Vextar said finally, your species has created a planetary system where cooperative agreements are maintained through the credible threat of enforcement by a coalition of nations? That's a somewhat militaristic way to put it, Santos replied. But yes, that's essentially how international law works. And this enforcement capability, Krailsh continued, is distributed across multiple nations but coordinated through central institutions? The UN Security Council, various regional organizations, allied command structures, Santos confirmed. No single nation dominates the system, but the system as a whole can respond to threats to international stability. Thyron's implants were clicking and whirring at a pace that suggested his processing systems were approaching their limits. Your species has solved the fundamental problem of maintaining cooperative agreements across multiple sovereign entities. Santos felt a moment of pride in humanity's diplomatic achievements, but something about the alien's intense focus was making her increasingly uncomfortable. I suppose we have, she agreed. It's taken centuries of trial and error, but we've managed to create a relatively stable international system. Stable, Vextar said, and his tone made the word sound like the most important concept in the galaxy. It wasn't until that evening, during what was supposed to be a casual dinner between the human and alien delegations, that the true purpose of the aliens' visit became clear. The meal was held in Harmony Station's central dining facility, which had been designed to accommodate the dietary and environmental needs of all the species present. The atmosphere was intended to be relaxed and informal, a chance for cultural exchange away from the formal negotiating sessions, but the conversation that developed was anything but casual. Secretary General Santos, Vextar began, his crystalline form generating light patterns that Santos had learned to associate with careful diplomatic phrasing. The Zephyrian Empire has been reconsidering our approach to the territorial dispute. Oh? Santos replied, sensing that something significant was about to be discussed. The Kassaran Dominion has reached similar conclusions. Krailsh added, her 6 eyes focusing on Santos with predatory intensity. As has the Vorthan Republic, Theron concluded, his cybernetic systems humming with what sounded like nervous energy. Santos looked around the table at 3 alien beings who had spent months in bitter territorial negotiations but now seemed to be coordinating their approach to whatever they were about to propose. What kind of conclusions? She asked carefully. The cooperative framework you suggested for the Kepler Nexus systems, Vextar explained, would require enforcement mechanisms to ensure long-term stability. All cooperative agreements require enforcement mechanisms, Krelsch continued, or they eventually collapse when one party calculates that violation has become more profitable than compliance. Our three civilizations, Theron concluded, lack the neutral authority necessary to provide credible enforcement for multi-party agreements. Santos felt reality shifting around her as she began to understand where this conversation was headed. And you think Earth could provide that neutral authority? We think, Vextar said carefully, that your species has demonstrated practical experience with the enforcement of cooperative agreements across multiple sovereign entities. Your planet, Krelsch added, has successfully maintained stability through the credible threat of intervention against parties that violate international standards. Your military capabilities, Theron concluded, while primitive by galactic standards, appear to be sufficient for enforcement operations within this regional galactic sector. Santos stared at the alien delegates, trying to process the implications of what they were suggesting. You want Earth to serve as galactic police for your territorial agreement? Not just our agreement, Vextar clarified. The success of cooperative frameworks in the Kepler Nexus would establish precedents for similar agreements throughout this region of the galaxy. Other territorial disputes, Krelsch explained, other resource conflicts, other situations where competitive approaches have proven suboptimal. Your species could serve as neutral arbitrators and enforcement agents for a new form of galactic diplomacy, Theron said, his massive form leaning forward with obvious interest. Santos felt vertigo as she realized that humanity had somehow gone from being dismissed as primitive innkeepers to being recruited as galactic peacekeeping forces. But we're just one planet, she protested. Our technology is centuries behind yours. How could we possibly enforce agreements between galactic civilizations? The alien delegates exchanged glances that conveyed volumes of silent communication. Secretary General, Vextar said finally, your species appears to have misunderstood the nature of enforcement in civilized galactic society. Enforcement is not about superior technology or overwhelming military force, Krelsch explained. It is about credible commitment to intervention and the political will to follow through on deterrent threats. Your species, Theron continued, has demonstrated both the practical experience and the cultural frameworks necessary for effective peacekeeping operations. Santos felt like she was missing something fundamental about the conversation. But surely your civilizations have more advanced military capabilities than anything Earth could deploy? Advanced military capabilities, Vextar replied, are not necessarily effective enforcement mechanisms. They create resistance, encourage arms races, and destabilize the very cooperative frameworks they are meant to protect. Enforcement, Krelsch added, works best when all parties understand that the enforcing authority has no territorial ambitions or competitive interests in the disputes being resolved. Your species, Theron concluded, is ideal for galactic peacekeeping precisely because you lack the capability to threaten galactic civilizations. Santos stared at them in amazement. You want us to be galactic police because we're too weak. To be galactic conquerors? We want you to be galactic peacekeepers, Vextar corrected, because you are strong enough to intervene effectively, but weak enough to be trusted with that authority. But what if we refuse? Santos asked. What if Earth decides we're not interested in galactic peacekeeping responsibilities? The silence that followed was filled with the kind of alien communication that made the station's sensors register multiple warning signals. Secretary General, Krelsch said finally, her serpentine form coiling with what Santos was learning to recognize as nervous energy. Your species has already demonstrated the willingness and capability to intervene in conflicts that threaten stability. The question is not whether you will serve as peacekeepers, but whether you will do so within a formal framework that provides appropriate compensation and recognition. Santos felt a chill as she realized that the aliens weren't just making an offer, they were stating a fact. Humanity had already been cast in the role of galactic peacekeepers, whether they wanted it or not. What kind of compensation and recognition? She asked carefully. Membership in the Galactic Council, Vextar replied immediately. Full voting rights, access to advanced technologies, preferential trade agreements. Protected status for your home system, Krailch added. No military actions allowed within Sol space without Earth's explicit approval. Neutral zone designation for your planet, Theron concluded. Earth becomes the galaxy's permanent diplomatic center for conflict resolution. Santos realized that she was being offered everything humanity had ever dreamed of in terms of galactic integration, but the price was accepting responsibility for maintaining peace throughout their region of space. And if conflicts arise that we can't resolve peacefully? She asked. Then you resolve them through other means, Vextar replied matter-of-factly. Your species has demonstrated the willingness to use force when diplomatic solutions prove insufficient. The galaxy, Krailch added, would benefit from having peacekeepers who understand that sometimes peace must be imposed rather than negotiated. Your military capabilities may be primitive, Theron said, but they appeared to be effective against the threats this region is likely to face. Santos looked around the table at alien beings who had somehow convinced themselves that humanity was both too primitive to threaten them and sufficiently advanced to keep their conflicts under control. I'll need to discuss this with the other world leaders, she said finally. Of course, Vextar replied. But we should mention that word of your peacekeeping capabilities has already begun to spread through diplomatic channels. Other conflicts, Krailch added, other territorial disputes and resource competition scenarios are already being brought to our attention as candidates for Earth-mediated resolution. The demand for your services, Theron concluded, is likely to exceed your current capacity for some time. Santos felt reality reshaping itself around her as she realized that humanity had accidentally become the galaxy's go-to solution for impossible diplomatic problems. 6 months later, Secretary General Santos stood in the newly constructed Galactic Diplomatic Center in Geneva. Watching alien delegations from 17 different conflicts file into briefing rooms, where human mediators would attempt to find peaceful solutions to disputes that threatened to destabilize entire sectors of space. The Earth had been officially designated as the galaxy's primary neutral zone, with protected status that made military action within the Sol system a crime against galactic civilization. Humanity had been granted full membership in the Galactic Council, access to technologies that were advancing human civilization by centuries, and trade agreements that were making Earth one of the wealthiest planets in known space. In exchange, humanity had accepted responsibility for mediating, arbitrating, and when necessary, enforcing peaceful solutions to conflicts throughout their region of the galaxy. Secretary General Hayes said, joining Santos at the observation deck overlooking the diplomatic complex, we've got a new situation developing in the Vega sector. 3 more civilizations requesting Earth mediation for a resource dispute. What's our capacity? Santos asked, though she already knew the answer would strain their resources further. We're at about 150% of optimal capacity, Hayes replied. But the interesting thing is that most of these conflicts are resolving themselves before we even deploy mediation teams, because the parties would rather negotiate between themselves than explain to their populations why they're fighting a war while Earth is watching, Santos concluded. Exactly. Our reputation for ... Conflict resolution is apparently serving as a deterrent to military solutions. Santos smiled as she watched alien diplomats who had traveled hundreds of light years to have their disputes resolved by a species they still considered primitive. General, do you think humanity is actually good at this peacekeeping role? Hayes considered the question seriously. I think we're terrifyingly effective at it, which may be the same thing. How so? The aliens are afraid of us, Hayes said. Bluntly, they've convinced themselves that we're too primitive to have hidden agendas but too competent to ignore when we make suggestions about conflict resolution. And that works? Better than anything they've tried before. Galaxy-wide conflict casualties are down by 90% since we started taking mediation requests. Partly because we're effective mediators, but mostly because nobody wants to be the civilization that ignored Earth's peace proposals and had to explain the consequences to their population. Santos looked out at the bustling diplomatic complex, where representatives from dozens of alien civilizations worked with human mediators to resolve disputes that would have led to devastating wars under the old system. So we've become galactic peacekeepers, not because we're particularly peaceful, but because we're too dangerous to ignore when we suggest that other people should be peaceful. In a nutshell, yes, Hayes confirmed. The galaxy has decided that it's safer to resolve conflicts diplomatically than to risk finding out what happens when humanity gets annoyed about interstellar warfare. And we have no idea how we got this reputation? Hayes laughed. Secretary General, we demonstrated our basic defensive capabilities to representatives from 3 galactic empires. They went home and told everyone that Earth has military assets distributed throughout an entire star system, with rapid deployment capabilities and coordination protocols that suggest we practice for large-scale enforcement operations on a regular basis. Which is all true, Santos pointed out. Which is all true, Hayes agreed. But we described it as normal military readiness while they interpreted it as evidence that we're a warrior species disguised as diplomats. Santos shook her head in amazement. So the galaxy's most feared neutral zone is feared because we're too honest about our military capabilities? The galaxy's most feared neutral zone is feared, Hayes corrected, because we're the only species that has ever casually mentioned our ability to destroy cities while serving tea to visiting dignitaries. As if to emphasize Hayes's point, an alert came through their communication systems indicating that another conflict had been referred to Earth for mediation. This time it was a dispute between 7 different civilizations over mining rights in an asteroid belt that contained strategic minerals. 7 civilizations, Santos said, reading the summary. Estimated military casualties if the dispute escalates to war, 43 million. Projected economic damage, approximately equal to the GDP of most galactic civilizations. And they're asking us to resolve it because ... because we're the scary neutral arbitrators who everyone trusts to be fair, but nobody wants to cross. Santos finished. Hayes grinned. I love our job. Santos looked out at the diplomatic complex where humanity was quietly reshaping the galaxy's approach to conflict resolution, one impossible peace negotiation at a time. General, she said finally, I think we may have accidentally created the most effective peacekeeping system in galactic history. By being too dangerous to ignore and too primitive to understand, Hayes agreed. And none of our alien clients realize that we have no idea what we're doing. Secretary General, Hayes replied with a kind of professional confidence that had served her through decades of military service. The day they figure that out is the day we'll really have to get good at this job. But as alerts continue to arrive from conflicts throughout the galaxy, all requesting Earth's mediation services, Santos realized that humanity had achieved something unprecedented in galactic history. They had become indispensable peacekeepers not through superior wisdom or advanced technology, but through the simple expedient of being too competent to be dismissed and too dangerous to be ignored. The galaxy's most feared neutral zone had been created by a species that genuinely wanted peace, but was so accidentally terrifying that everyone else preferred to solve their problems diplomatically rather than risk finding out what would happen if they didn't, and somehow that was working better than any peacekeeping system the galaxy had ever tried before. Hey there, incredible humans. If that story didn't completely blow your mind about how humanity accidentally became the galaxy's most terrifying peacekeepers, I don't know what will. We just discovered that our genuine desire to help, combined with our casual attitude toward planetary-scale violence, has made us the most effective neutral arbitrators in galactic history because everyone's too scared to ignore our suggestions about peace. Think about this for a second. Right now, Earth already has all the infrastructure that made us accidentally terrifying to those alien civilizations. We do have military assets distributed throughout our solar system. We do practice for large-scale enforcement operations regularly. We do have the ability to project force anywhere it might be needed. We just call it normal military readiness instead of galactic intimidation capabilities. The most hilarious part? We achieved galactic dominance through pure honesty. We told them exactly what our military could do, and they interpreted our matter-of-fact descriptions as evidence that we're warrior diplomats who practice planet-scale conflict resolution for fun. I want to know what you think. Drop a comment below telling me which moment made you realize that humans aren't the good guys in galactic politics. We're the boogeyman everyone's afraid of. Was it when we casually mentioned our city removal devices? When we described global warfare as learning experiences? Or when we offered to demonstrate our basic defensive capabilities? And absolutely smash that like button if this story made you proud to be part of the species that accidentally became the galaxy's most feared peacekeepers through sheer, terrifying competence. I've got another mind-bending story lined up that explores what happens when humans discover that the galaxy's most advanced AI has been pretending to be broken for millions of years, and it's been waiting for someone primitive enough to fix it properly. Trust me, you won't want to miss how humanity's backward approach to technology accidentally unlocks the universe's greatest mystery. Until next time, remember, sometimes the most effective way to keep the peace is to be too dangerous to ignore when you politely suggest that everyone should get along. See you in the next one, fellow accidental galactic overlords.